following a slightly different template than the rest. Both George and I were asked by Chris to reflect on Jim's role in our own work, which I already knew was profound, but that charge created the obligation to go back and think about that harder than I had before, with which I discovered that it was even more profound than I knew. And actually, the discussion of yesterday and today just keeps on adding to that. So this is a very interesting experience for me. The first thing that Jim was in my work, so people at this table are the reason I am at this table in a very real way. It was Mark and George's and Mark and John and a bunch of other people, both in this room and very close to people in this room, who launched this project thinking about policing at the Kennedy School, and drawing on folks from all over the country, in fact internationally in the early 80s. And I was tapped to do field research for that project. It was the first contact I'd had with any of these issues and most of these people. And I had no more interest in it than any of the other things that I was being told to do at the time. I was a writer, and writers are sluts. Writers devote themselves to what is in front of them and very quickly forget about it and move on. And that was the very happy space that I was in. And in that process, I met Jim Wilson. And this is personal, but it was a very personal experience, so I'll talk about it that way. So the first, and in many ways, the most important thing about Jim for many of us was that he was welcoming. And Jim was always the most important person in any room that he was in, both by weight of his intellect and his scholarship and by weight of simply who he was and the kind of character and magnetism that he radiated. And I think it could not have been anything but an extraordinary burden. You cannot have everybody wanting a piece of you and to stand next to you and to hear your idea and to have hands laid on without it being exhausting. And I never once saw Jim be anything but gracious about it. And it must have been extraordinary discipline and commitment that kept him going in that way. One of my most treasured memories of my career is very early on. This is one of the first times I met Jim. And Mark and George, we were all talking about gun policy because it was the gun epidemic. And we just convened a brown bag lunch. And I was by an enormous margin the least significant person in the room. And nonetheless, Jim and I found ourselves vamping about guns and gun policy. It was this moment where one of the big ideas in the field was smart guns, so guns that recognized a ring or recognized a little radio transmitter or fingerprint or something like that, so they couldn't be taken away and used by somebody else. And if you know the literature on gun violence, there's prison research that shows an extraordinary overlap between drunkenness and gun crime. If you interview felons, then the amount of alcohol that they have consumed before they shot the person that got them locked up, even for people who know this stuff, it's astonishing. And Jim and I found ourselves vamping on this and laughing uncontrollably about the idea that what we needed was not smart guns. It was guns with built-in breathalyzer. And if you couldn't blow .001, the thing wouldn't fire. Everybody would be much better off. And the public health campaign that came up that would go along with this was the innovative slogan that friends don't let friends drink and aim. But this was what he was like. You know, he didn't care who you were. He helped, and that was really quite wonderful. The community policing work began with extensive field work, so I'm fascinated by the degree to which all of these conversations have begun with this idea of going out and looking, which is, as we're all aware, increasingly déclassé. Mark did not believe in this. to my enormous good fortune, Mark believed in having other people go out and look on his behalf, which is what I did for about 10 years. And it was a not very well thought through saturation in all of the issues that we are talking about. What goes on out there, how do police behave, what are neighborhoods, how does criminal justice really happen out there, what are thugs really like, all that kind of thing. And in my own work, I do very focused, pragmatic crime control work in mostly really blasted black communities. And every single thing that has made its way into our operational portfolio has begun with street observation. Just like George's work has, we have seen things on the street that nobody understood. We have then gone back to the literature and gone back to scholarly tools, but nothing would have come from looking at the data sets. And it is, I think, enormously important that that is true and to try to keep that tradition going. Jim believed that police mattered, and it was a posture at the time that was really not very respected. So if you were on the left, you thought police were the problem. If you were on the right, you thought that police were the front end of a larger and more important criminal justice system. It was not fashionable to believe that police were independently important as an institution, you know, in the public realm and in the community. Whether from a kind of jump-off point or because of his own field work, Jim felt otherwise. Jim thought that neighborhoods were important in a variety of important ways. So George was just talking about the controversies around the idea of broken windows and the controversies surround this causal argument that disorder leads to serious crime and that there is that progressive causal mechanism, and that by way of intervention you can intervene with disorder and do something about violent crime. I think that's correct, right? But it is a second order idea. And if you read Broken Windows, one of the key paragraphs in Broken Windows is that simply by declaration, Jim and George said neighborhoods should be safe and orderly. Believe it or not, that is also not what people thought at the time, right? Because for all sorts of reasons we understand, the left was busily saying that all that stuff out there doesn't matter, right? It's just cultural expression and we shouldn't criminalize it and we shouldn't take it seriously, and that was actually bigotry and racism to say that people couldn't behave like in public. And on the right, it didn't rise to the level of serious crime, so we're not going to pay any attention to it. And it left this enormous void where people actually lived in extraordinary misery. And in my own attachment to these folks and these ideas and this work came in exactly the same way. I went to appalling places in the very early days of the crack epidemic and saw what was going on and had this absolutely unmediated, visceral reaction that said, this is not okay. And Jim understood that in a lot of very important ways. He understood that the most important locus of creating public safety is informal social control in the neighborhoods. So this is an idea in Broken Windows, it's an idea at the end of thinking about crime. It was also not an idea that was widely understood or widely believed. And I'm going to say that in the course of some very important evolution in how you actually do crime control, the rest of the field is actually only now beginning to understand how true that is and how concrete it can be. So in our work, we can identify 1% of the young men in the hottest neighborhoods who are actually driving things. And we are, in fact, organizing folks in the neighborhoods, community elders, and people of natural standing in the neighborhoods to go to that 1% and say, we do not like what you are doing and we need you to stop it. And they do, right? So these are operationalizable ideas that are not just up here. They are very, very granular. Jim understood the importance of values. So I was fascinated in listening to Mark about this conflict in Jim, which I accept. The way I experienced it was through Jim's writing. where there is no conflict evident whatsoever. And one of the things I admire about Jim, I thought I learned all this from Mark. And now I'm wondering where it really came from. But what Mark has always been exceptionally smart about, among many other things, but I admire him maybe the most for this, and I found it the most useful. You cannot think about crime and justice and criminal justice without understanding the irreducible central role of norms. Breaking your leg because you've been hit by a car is different than having your leg broken because you've been mugged. They are different events with different meaning, and there's different obligations, and they have different social ripples. And if you don't get that, then you are operating in an era of sort of technical movement that misses the guts of what's going on. And when Jim said things like neighborhoods are the most important thing, not only is he respecting that, but he found a way to write about it and be clear about it that left it open to engaging. It wasn't implicit, it wasn't imported, it was crystal clear. And in the Glenn Lowry post, with which I have many issues, but one of them that would not normally get everybody upset, but does get me, is that he says that a lot of Jim's writing is just supercharged journalism. And I think that is not only wrong, it misses the fact that you have to find a way to talk about these public policy issues in a way that is as honest as doing serious empirical work. It's different, but you have to have the same kind of obligations to truth, to transparency, to giving your opponents the tools that they need to engage you. And Jim found a way to talk about this stuff. And it looks easy, and it's not. He was tremendously artful about it. He believed in right and wrong. And I'm going to come to this in a minute, but I'm about 95% in agreement with him. Shooting another human being is not just a crime. It's not just a bad choice, as the social workers like to say. It's wrong. And if we miss that, we miss something very, very, very important. If you don't think it's wrong, then I'll be able to argue with you about that. But part of what's so important about a lot of this stuff is that you don't actually find anybody who disagrees with that. And the sort of faux empiricism and faux rigor that we impose on ourselves that walls that stuff out of discourse is faux. And Jim understood that, he knew how to deal with this stuff. And he liked, for example, he loved the word wicked. I love reading Jim talking about wickedness because he was right about a lot of that. And then sometimes he wasn't, and so we'll come back to that. But where does this get us? It gets us to a point where Jim believed that the police should be an independent, active force for creating civil communities in a way that built on and strengthened the natural resources of those neighborhoods. And to this day, I can't think of a better brief for what we ought to be doing here, not just in public safety, but not just in policing, but in public safety as well. Okay, so here's the other side. The other side is that in Jim's writing about all of this, there was all too frequently a whiff of grape shot. So Broken Windows talks about, in somewhat nostalgic terms, the bygone days in which police kept order by kicking ass. And you wait for the moment where he says, and of course that's not quite what we want to do anymore, and it never comes.
Jim was worried about that phrase. It was mine.
Okay, so here's the next example. In 1994, Jim published an op-ed piece in the New York Times. This is the beginning of, it's not the beginning, it's well into, which is why I wrote the youth gun violence epidemic that we were all focusing on. And it is called Just Take Away Their Guns. And it said gun control won't work, about which I largely agree with him. Therefore, we just need to stop people on the street and take their guns away from them. And I remember sitting in the tower and reading this and feeling my heart sink through the floor Because anybody who knows policing, and anybody who knows these neighborhoods, and Jim knew both, knows what that would mean in practice. And we've got lots of examples, unfortunately, now of what that does mean in practice. I went back and reread it as part of this process. And it is, the language is great. It observes all the verities, raises the right issues, raises the right warnings, and then he just lets it lie there. And what Jim, I think, didn't understand as well as he might have. So I'm going to venture that Jim didn't go out and look with thugs. I think Jim thought he understood wickedness better than he did. And George immersed himself with the homeless. And when you get to know the homeless, you discover the homeless are not what you think they are. My work has been, in part, spending time with the wicked. And when you spend time with the wicked, you realize the wicked aren't what you think they are either. They are doing wicked things, but they are not necessarily wicked people. And if Jim had had a better sense of the pressures and the dynamics and the conflict and the group dynamics and all the things that we now know generate wicked behavior by folks, then he might have had a little bit more sympathy and a little bit more perspective on very important uses of very, very serious state authority. And then I want to end on the note I began with, and which is to say that in the end, it doesn't matter, because he changed his mind. And one of the things I admire most about Jim, and it's something we should all take a lesson from, is that I don't think I know anybody of his stature, maybe anybody at all, actually, in sort of intellectual life, who was more willing to say I was wrong and change his mind on the basis of new evidence. And when some other stuff came along to do that same job, George has been involved in it, Mark's been involved in it, I've been involved in it, there were other ways of achieving these same ends that didn't involve these profligate uses of state power. He was in the forefront cheering. And I'll end again on this personal note, which is when I was part of the stuff that began here in Boston, and had the same experience that George has had. You write this stuff up, you get it out there, and the world descends on you. You are wrong, it never happened, something else really happened. Regression to the mean, all that sort of stuff. It was really ugly there for a while. And Jim was one of the very few people who understood what we were doing, was able to put it into a paragraph, believed that it was real, understood why it was important, and said so out loud. And for that, I am personally extraordinarily grateful.
I've been instructed by my boss that we actually have time for questions, for some discourse. So I'm gonna first, I guess I'll ask if anyone wants to say anything. I'll just do that. I'll just turn it over to you. All right, over to you. Yes, Larry.
Is there a microphone, or I'm just going to shout?
Yeah. You got a big voice, Larry.
I want to probe the reasons why there was this academic hostility to much that Jim said, and that you also have said, David. I think you have to ask why people resisted enforcing crime on criminals, where even though it would make neighborhoods safer and benefit many disadvantaged people. Why is there such resistance? I think the reason is that when you enforce the criminal law, you presume that people are personally responsible for something. And that is contestable. In the current environment, given who is committing the crimes, largely disadvantaged people, usually not white, etc., we hesitate, many hesitate, I hesitate, to assume the full rigor of personal responsibility. When you expect that, you are imposing what I call the burdens of freedom on those whom you hold responsible. And it's resistance to that I think accounts for most of the academic resistance to what Jim stands for. And a criticism I would make of him is that until late in his life, he didn't address this issue correctly. He didn't address it frontally. The place where he addresses it most directly probably is one of his very last books on moral judgment, where he actually criticizes academics for promoting an idea that those accused of crimes are not really responsible for themselves. And he wants to go back. Now, I don't go all the way with critics. I think we do have to assume some responsibility. But we have to be aware of the resistance and the reasons for the resistance, because it really has to do with what you assume about responsibility. And underlying that is the question of competence. How much are people able to be held responsible for anything? To what extent do they have self-command, use a phrase that Marx used and I personally like. The variations there tend to map the variations you assume about external barriers to opportunity in the poverty welfare debate. That's what it's all about. I came to the conclusion early that your judgments about barriers are the flip side. Your judgments about competence, about the poor themselves. And I think that's also true here. And I guess I would ask those assembled here, did Jim ever address the question of competence and responsibility frontally and admit that this was a key variable in the discourse? My sense is that he didn't until this late reflection on moral responsibility. And one reason he didn't was he had this essentially conservative view of the social ideal, which went back to a world in which personal responsibility could be assumed without question. And then in his career, as he got into the 60s, 70s, when all these questions of race, disadvantage, responsibility came out on the surface, at that point, they became much more contestable than they were in Jim's upbringing. See, he never fully addressed it. And in order to address it more fully, you have to come from another part of the country, have another form of experience, where these questions about competence are frontal. And he didn't have that. And I think that's one of the reasons why his social awareness was, as some have been saying, actually quite limited.
So let me take a crack at that. So the first thing I'll do is, so the arguments you've made and laid out they're right. They represent the pole of a debate. I don't think, in fact, they represent at all the dynamic that people trying to do work in these areas engage with. So you've laid out a kind of philosophy of punishment argument. That's not what's going on out there. What's going on out there is that there's a camp of people who believe that people are bad because they've been victimized and they want to help them. And there are other people who think people do bad things because they're bad and they want to punish them. And that's about as sophisticated as the real.
And you don't think it's really about competence? It's really not about responsibility. You don't think.
Well, it always has to be in the end. But then what you discover about the folks who make the sort of left argument on this is that they're wrong on the facts. And they're wrong on the facts, at least in the following way, which is that if the argument were true, then we would be hip deep in bodies and chaos and degradation, and we're not. Because in the places and amongst the population that people are happily willing to write off as being completely incapable of controlling themselves, nearly everybody does, nearly all the time. And then when you talk to the people who don't, they actually will tell you behind closed doors that they've done wrong. Right? This is an imposition of outside ideas on places where, just to say it again, people have not gone and looked. And what turns out to be so bizarre about this is that, and this is not conscious, you just live here long enough and you realize it's true, that the only thing the left and the right agree on is that people in these situations ought not to be held morally accountable and should not be made the subject of moral engagement. Because if you're in the left camp, they're victims and you don't blame victims. If you're in the right camp, they're psychopaths and you don't reason with a psychopath. And the one thing that nobody will do is say you're doing wrong, don't do it. And then we're shocked by the fact that they don't understand the difference between right and wrong. Yeah, please.
I think what Larry said is true, but I think there's, I want to defend the critics of the Wilsonian view, which is substantially my view. They got something that lots of us missed, which is, again, what looks to us as social engineers like the necessary infliction of suffering in order to control behavior, looks on the ground like cruelty. And that the cop who addresses the kid as motherfucker is a reality along with the mugging. I've said before that the debate about criminal justice in the United States seems to be conducted between the disciples of Michel Foucault and the disciples of the Marquis de Sade. And Jim was not on the sadist side of that.
Yeah, correct.
But I think he underestimated the sadism he endorsed. And I think his critics, our critics, wrong on lots of stuff, right on that piece. And right on the piece that once you start to license yourself to inflict cruelty, it's hard to kill yourself.
I think the other Mark wants to say.
Yeah, let me just make 2 quick comments about Larry's excellent point. I agree with you, Larry, that all of this is, or at the center of this, is both the question of moral responsibility and the right response to moral responsibility, right? And then that introduces a moral framework that is either a utilitarian framework that makes a calculation about how we can intervene in a way that changes the behavior, or a deontological framework that says what would be just and right to do in that particular case. But then, having said that, let me take another step forward and say that I think there are 2 practical questions here that represent an intellectual front for us at this stage, right? And one of them, David said, and I think this is the only thing David said today that I disagreed with even slightly, was that we don't actually talk to people about doing the right thing, right? I think at the policy level conversation, that doesn't happen, right? I think at the individual level, when a law enforcement officer stands up and says, come along, or when, for that matter, in your field, a welfare to work person says, you really ought to go out and get a job, right? There's an obligation encounter that's going on there between the state and an individual through the apparatus of a public agency, right? And what I think is a practical matter is that we often don't exactly know how to construct those obligation encounters in a way that will be both just and produce the behavioral effect that we want. It's too crude, it doesn't get at the right elements of the context, it doesn't find the person who could be both motivated and influential with respect to the other person and stuff like that.
It doesn't start with an expression of goodwill.
So if you start with an expression of goodwill and hopefulness, and then there's a construction of obligation around the set of things that need to get done, that's what we have to learn about. And one of the things that makes our public management job so interesting is that so much of what the state does is around the delivery of obligations, at least as much as around the delivery of services. And then the interesting question is what does it look like when we mechanically construct that in a powerful way? And if you're going to do that powerfully, you're always going to have to take advantage of an existing moral order, both substantively and practically existing in somebody's life. That's the way you're going to do it, right? So there's this practical question on figuring out how to construct moral encounters or obligation encounters in a useful way. There's this other deeper question, though, and this is what I'm deeply puzzled by right at the moment, and I think we've made some progress on this over 20 years or so. But there was this awkward, deep social science question, right, of whether we could understand the causes of crime, and whether then they were genetic or biological or environmental or blah, blah, blah. You run down the list of favorite, so take each social science discipline and identify their favorite variable as the explanation of violence and crime, right? So you've got that long list, right? And you stare at that, and of course what people are trying to do when they're doing social science is to try to figure out what the biggest variance in the outcome is that's associated with each of these effects, right? And even aside from whether that's a possible empirical project, right? Conceptually, it's very hard to think about that. But in the background of that is a question not only about effectiveness, but also where it would be right to place the blame, all right? And it turns out that there's this theory of liability that goes along with causation, right? And there's a moral theory about, well, who should we call to account for this criminal conduct? And there are a lot of different answers to that. Social scientists would say, well, the just answer would be, put it on the biggest beta coefficient, right? A lawyer would say, put the causation on the person who has the greatest moral culpability, right? An economist would say, put the liability on the thing that will make the biggest response to having the liability placed on it, right? I mean, there are all these different ideas about how to construct liability in the presence of a causal system. But what I think we haven't fully come to grips with is this important question of whether moral competence and virtue is naturally distributed or whether it's constructed in a society, right? And in either case, it could be good or bad news, right? We know we know from raising children, you know, we all have raised, that some kind of moral competence and capacity has to be constructed in individuals. It doesn't naturally exist there at the beginning, right? We go through a process of learning how to be responsible citizens at some level. So, but then the question, if that's true, and if social conditions are constructing the individual capacities for moral competence, right? And we have some responsibility for making sure that everybody has an equal chance to get to a level of moral competence such that it would be appropriate to call them to account for their crimes, right? Then that's a whole different, that's what the challenges of meshing, in some sense, social policy with criminal justice policy would be about, right? If we could ever figure that out, and what it would mean to have a just criminal justice system in a currently unjust world. And what I mean by an unjust world is a world that is unevenly distributing the capacities for moral action and achievement among individuals in the society. See what I'm saying?
Let me just, I know George, we have to break it momentarily. I know George wanted to make a final comment.
Chris raised the issue of the tentativeness of the original Broken Windows article. And for those of you who haven't read it or reread it again, understand this was, read it from the position of 1982. Remember in 1982, at least with policing, but remember the Martinson article, nothing worked. And we were wrestling with the idea of what might possibly work. And I think for the first time applying to criminal justice, the idea that a community can be victimized as well as individuals being victimized. And I think that was one of the big ideas that came out of Broken Windows, this idea that you could victimize a community by an aggregation of events. One prostitute in a neighborhood isn't much of a problem. 20 prostitutes can tear the neighborhood apart. The second thing, with due deference to David, please, if you think I wrote Justifying, or Jim and I wrote Justifying Kicking Ass, read it within its context. It's the dilemma of what are police to do given the current circumstances. And it's as much of, and I talk about an officer who's struggling about what to do outside of, some of you might remember the Robert Taylor homes in Chicago. What is that officer supposed to do when called in response to the fact that there are gang members hanging around an external elevator? And one officer said to me, it was slightly different, I say please once, I say please twice, and then I knock them on their ass. And, you know, within that context, it didn't appear all that unreasonable, given the resources that the officer had, the demand placed upon the officer, and the fact that the sole, and I'll use the David phrase, the sole response of policing at that time to any problem was to send a car.
Yeah.
To do what? Nobody had the slightest idea.
We are done. Thank you.